Anyone who works in hospitals, what's the most insane thing you've seen? 20-year-old put his sport bike into guardrails at high speed. Arrived alive and ultimately survived with left arm, left leg, and right leg completely severed from his body. Just formalized all 3 amputations and surgery for hemostasis and skin coverage. Runner-up was a girl in her 30 seconds with a locking blade knife stabbed through the left temple all the way to the hilt with the blade, crossing through her sinuses to the other side of her face. She was completely fine, and we removed the knife with no significant problems resulting. I was 11:07 p.m. critical care supervisor in a 400-bed community hospital in Texas. Around 1981 or so, we had a rush admission from the oncology floor. A middle-aged lady with ovarian cancer and metastases started to vaginal hemorrhage. The ER physician on call for codes ordered her transferred, while I tried to get a hold of her surgeon. He wouldn't return calls or attend the patient. I got orders from the ER doc for heavy pain medication and called the chief of surgery, who was there in 30 minutes. The RNs and aides were carrying basins of blood out of the room. Thankfully, she passed relatively peacefully. The surgeon was thrown off the staff when more neglect and poor treatment was revealed. Not the most insane, but certain very shocking. A young man less than 25 tried to off himself with a shotgun blast under his chin after his GF died of cancer. He did not succeed, but what he lost was his jaw, his nose, his eyes, and part of his frontal lobe. I'm a physical therapist and was sent in to evaluate his discharge disposition. All his notes said was GSW to head. It did not specify the damages. He had no face, it was just raw meat and exposed bone. They couldn't really dress it because it would get in the way of his breathing. He had something like 14 reconstruction surgeries planned. He lost his POA and his mom pushed for all of his rehab and care. In the 60s, one of my aunties worked in the hospital when a 20-something strapping lad came in from an accident that severely damaged his brain. He had other injuries and would not have survived. But his family had money and insisted that every effort be made to save his life, so they saved his life. This left a 20-something strapping lad with no internal controls of any kind. The hospital warned that he would need care for the rest of his life, and the family had signed off on that. He was a big guy. He would beat the S out of you for a cookie. The family quickly realized that they could not keep him at home, and he ended up in an institution. We periodically wonder what happened to him. I was a radiology assistant and handled a lot of images. Our office was remote, and we pulled and read for several dozen hospitals. A fellow nicknamed Jesus. He took an 80 swan dive off of a bridge onto railroad tracks. He was, amazingly, still conscious when they brought him in, and he was talking to everyone, flirting with the nurses, and acting like he just woke up and was waiting on a cup of coffee. He broke dozens of bones but had no other major trauma, not even a concussion. Piercings. Lots and lots of piercings. They show up on x-rays. Real weird when you see the name of someone, pop up and see that, oh, they have a half-pound of rings in their junk. CA. The worst was when you would see an image and know that this kid had been broken and beaten before because they had healed the old wounds. I spent more than one shift talking down an ER doctor so they could do their job when a child came in absolutely destroyed by their parents or caregivers. Guy went into his neighbor's garage and used a saw to cut his own leg off. He was with us for a couple weeks. I asked him, why would you do that soon after admission? He simply stated, you can cut your hair or nails. Why can't I cut my leg off? Welp can't argue with that logic. It wasn't until a few weeks later he was working with therapy and trying to manage transfers and daily living tasks that he came to the realization, yeah, maybe I shouldn't have done that. Define insane. Critical care doctor here. Insane. A late 22-year-old woman of about 35 kilograms, 120 centimeters size, that's 77 lbs, 4 feet, with multiple congenital abnormalities resulting in an inability to eat, talk, read, or understand who had been that way since birth. She required total care for every bodily function and had for her entire life. She was in and out of the hospital monthly due to what was essentially unfixable body failure. Each time we had to jam tubes in her, put her on various forms of life support, and repeatedly subject her to painful procedures while knowing all along that we could not, and would not ever fix her in any kind of meaningful way. She was neurologically gone, yet her mother insisted she responded to her and expressed her feelings, insisting that we do everything. Ultimately, we had to put this poor soul through the pointlessness of prolonged CPR before she finally died. That was insane and cruel. Had an admission on the medical floor. A man had been found at his home lying on the floor. Apparently he had suffered from a CVA stroke and had been on the floor for quite some time. The gentleman lived alone in a small house without neighbors nearby. He was eventually found, I am unsure by who and how, and brought to the ED. Upon his ED visit, he was found to have developed decubitus bed sores to one of his hips and upper arm from where he had lain on the floor. There were maggots in the bed sores. I don't work in a hospital, but I have the utmost respect for an ER nurse on duty when I had to take a classmate to the ER in college. It's 11 p.m. on a Thursday and it's quiet. The phone rings and the nurse answers. I only heard her side of the conversation. N, hospital ER. N, I'm sorry, what about tennis balls? N, a tennis ball machine. What about the machine? N, well, how close to it were you when the ball came out? N, and it hit you in the face. N, yes, you should have a doctor look at that. Do you need an ambulance? N, well, are any of your friends sober? You should not be driving after drinking and with a potential head injury. N, no, putting your beer in the cup holder isn't going to be enough. You either need to tell me where you are so I can send an ambulance, or you need a sober person to drive. N, I'm sure you are very good at driving left-handed, but that doesn't mean it's okay to drive with a beer in your right hand. N, okay, sir. If you still need help, please call. At this point, the caller hangs up. The nurse calmly puts down the phone, checks that there aren't too many people around, and cracks up laughing. Apparently, the guy thought the tennis ball launcher was broken, so he went up and looked down to launching mechanism, and a ball was launched directly into his eye. Definitely not a sober situation. By the time my classmate was admitted and moved upstairs, there was a pool going on if the guy would show up. I still wonder about that guy sometimes. My co-resident intern year had an elderly man brought in by EMS for rapidly progressive bilateral leg weakness. The patient was the kind of person who hadn't seen a doctor in decades. CT scan showed total occlusion of his abdominal aorta. The entire lower half of his body was dying. It was presumed he had an advanced malignancy that contributed to the hypercoagulable state. But by then, the cause didn't matter. Too much of his body hadn't been perfused properly for too long. The patient was calm throughout, seemed at peace with his impending death. He never even made it up to the floor, died in the ER. Fortunately, they had called his son who made it to the hospital to be with Dad when he passed. I didn't even know total occlusion of the abdominal aorta was possible. The fact the guy had been walking until very recently and only called because he couldn't walk anymore really blew my mind. The human body is crazy. My wife is a nurse and used to work in an ER close to a major city. They had a lot of mental patients come through all the time. Usually these patients have someone who sits at their door and keeps an eye on them. The person fell asleep, so the patient tried to escape by climbing into the ceiling tiles. He made it further than you would think, and the security guard waited until the guy was right above him. Punched his hand through a tile, grabbed the guy's ankle, and pulled him down through the ceiling. I always thought that sounded like something in a movie. From a previous answer to a similar question. Many years ago, when I was in my residence, a man entered ER with a hand in his forehead, walking by himself, asking for a doctor. You can imagine my surprise when I said yes to him removing his hand and showing his injury, a perforating hole from a bullet. He was quickly moved to surgery after that. Later, I found the bullet didn't reach the brain, it was well buried into the skull bone. I have taken care of more than one person over the age of 90 years old who tried to end their own life due to inability to cope with pain anymore. Extremely sad, but also understandable. Lowest HGB I ever saw was 3.5. Normal was above 12 at least. Person was walking, talking, and absolutely floors me every time I see it, but fungating breast wounds. One that smelled so necrotic that you could smell it down the hall and several rooms away. I was able to put most of my index finger in the breast wound, and the patient could not feel anything. Therapeutic leech decided to make a run for freedom and somehow escaped the ICU room and made it across the hall before the nurse realized. Left a trail of blood all the way from the bedside out into and across the hallway. Most disturbing, though, was probably a woman in the trauma ICU after sustaining a traumatic brain injury when a tree fell onto her car while she was driving. The tree ended her teenage son, who was the passenger in her car. The TBI had severely impaired her short-term memory, which meant she kept waking up on the ICU, panicking, asking how her son was doing and demanding to see him. So several times a day, this woman would learn anew that her son was gone. We had to ask the hospital ethics department if we should keep telling her he was gone. She was very insistent on seeing him if she was told he was alive, and force her to relive that pain over and over or lie to her repeatedly. It was horrendous. Do mental hospitals count? I was a patient in a mental wing of a hospital. Long story. I was there for 9 days, and I was literally the only sane person there. Anyway, 3 things I saw while I was there. The first was my roommate. He was around my age and relatively cognitive, but lacked common sense and seemed to have the capacity of a 6-year-old. In our room was a huge floor-to-ceiling cubby with 3 slots. He'd climb to the top cubby and belly flop himself onto his bed, a solid 9 feet or so. Very similar to the kid from Big Mama House. The second was a Caucasian woman who was there because she jumped through a glass window. Her head was shaved bald and she had stitch and staples all over her scalp. She was hissing and trying to bite at the techs. She was also yelling out, "Miller." Lastly was a 700-pound woman who covered herself in some sort of shiny liquid, what I assumed to be soap, because we were not allowed much. It was the middle of the night and I heard the techs on the ward call some sort of code. I peeked out my door and saw said woman, naked as the day she was born, oiled up, and slithering down the hall like a worm. My wife's grandfather was an ER doctor and then chief of medicine at our local hospital for many years, and at his funeral, one of the nurses told me a story. In the mid-1970s, there was a gang war going on in my hometown, basically 2 different biker gangs hammering each other. One night, 2 bikers brought a third into the ER who had been shot in the chest. The bikers put the wounded guy on a gurney and started grabbing nurses and threatening orderlies, screaming at them to help him. My wife's grandfather was working in the ER that night. He heard the commotion, walked over and just said, "If you don't leave right this second, I'm going to let him bleed out." They left. The guy survived. The nurse said it was the most cold-blooded thing she ever saw. A lot of people came to his funeral. Not a nurse, but my son has had 35 shunt revisions from having hydrocephalus due to being born with spina bifida. When he was 5, I noticed a scab on his head. He was sitting on his toilet chair, and I walked away for 2 seconds to grab something, and when I came back, he handed me the scab. I looked, and a pearl ball was looking back at me. I'm like squinting, and I'm like, that's not his skull.omg, that's his shunt. So I calmly called the children's hospital and asked for the neurosurgeon on call. It's a resident. I told him what I saw, and I'm like, it's his shunt. He keeps asking me the color, what it looks like over and over. I'm like, sir, it looks like a pearl bowling ball, but mini. Sure as tea, my kid's shunt burrowed out of his head. That led to a full shunt replacement after being on EVD drains for 14 days to make sure he didn't get an infection. He's 24 now and has had 90 surgeries. I could go on, but that is top 3 of the crazy tea. I wouldn't have survived him either without amazing nurses and doctors. Residents and fellows, I still side-eye and don't take their BS, but I've met more good ones than bad. My first job as a nurse was a med-surg oncology unit. There was an old man who was just skin and bones, whose treatment caused all of his nails to just fall off. Like I would roll him over and just find a pile of nails under him. To help protect his sensitive nail beds, his wife got him these long white cloth gloves. It's been over a decade, so I can't remember the name of the treatment, but what he was getting caused blood to pour from his tear ducts. There was a little blood spotting on the end of the white gloves as well. So imagine this man who was at death's door, blood pouring from his eyes, wearing bloody white cloth gloves. The guy's son thought it would be a good idea to bring his 5YO son in to see Grandpa. Guy looked straight out of a horror film, and the kid wriggled from his dad's arms and literally started running, screaming down the hallway. I felt so bad for the old man, who knew exactly how he looked, and I was very angry with the son for coming up with the genius move to show that traumatizing tea to a child. Worked in the PT-SPT depth of a smallish local hospital for 16 days. They completely lied about the job position. I received no training, not for the job they hired me for or the one I was actually doing, or sitting at the front desk, putting on a good show of F if I know, and here enters a smelly patient who quite literally made my eyes water. I'm like crying, smells bad, leans in close to me. I get woozy and feel like I'm about to start being rude. I was mad at this dude for being so smelly. I opened my mouth to say the bullshit about you have to sign in and have a seat, but instead of the mundane receptionist lines, I vomited. Like completely threw up my breakfast onto the desk. Keyboard, cute little wireless mouse, my lap, my brand new non-slip Skechers, all covered in banana nut muffin bile. The lady who answered the phones beside me jumped up and let me run past her, but I could already hear the smelling guy staring up. He threw up too. Guess I offended him. Whole effing place stinks. Like putrid hot garbage on a blazing Georgia summer day. The phone lady tries to help the smelly guy and slips and falls. Wasn't wearing her Skechers. Anyway, the dude had also shed himself. Standing up. She landed in it. I feel even more sick. One of the techs takes me to the bathroom where I waited out until I can drive home. I never went back. Still have my badge in a drawer somewhere. They literally never even bothered to tell me when to take a lunch break. So F them. Hope it stained the carpet. My mother-in-law is a nurse in home care. She visits patients at their homes. I just asked her what the worst experience she's ever had was. She's got a good few tales to tell. She'd just been assigned a patient that had been bedbound for some reason. This patient was a very naughty diabetic. He kept whining at her that he couldn't feel his right leg. This was her first visit to him, BTW. He was dubious about uncovering himself and refusing a catheter change. My mother-in-law finally convinced him, telling him some BS that his penis would fall off or something, so he finally let her uncover his lower half. His entire leg had rotted off his body, and there maggots in the wound and on his detached leg. A fast call to the Wisartsen post and an ambulance ride to the ER later. Apparently, she'd been assigned to him because he'd been refusing care from anyone else for months. And my mother-in-law is the best, apparently at dealing with and convincing difficult patients that are sound of mind to let her do her job. In the end, naughty diabetic dude had an extremely bad UTI, had to have 2 fingers and his other leg amputated up to the knee. I don't work in a hospital anymore, but I used to be a contractor on a project with a hospital's team. Craziest thing that I had seen was a guy in a hospital bed getting rushed to the organ with a nurse doing chest compressions on him at the same time. It was wild to watch. Someone is full-on sprinting this guy down a corridor. Person is doing CPR trying to get him back while doctors are right behind getting suited up to do whatever they're doing to the guy. And all I do is image and install computers all day. Second cool thing, I got to replace a PC that had an MRI on it. It was really cool scrolling the mouse and seeing the different layers to the brain, and the doctor is explaining the different parts and stuff. And in like, whoa, like that's happening in my brain as you're explaining it to me. Like, WTF, super cool. Edit. I know this comment doesn't compare to anything the other ones say, but here's another story that I remember. I was getting computers installed in the psych ward, and they had to make sure I was watched closely and had a nurse or someone with me at all times, because some people were known to be unhinged if you looked at them the wrong way. So I am in the main control room area, so to speak, and one of the nurses went to go check on the one guy. She opens the door to his room, and he full-on grabs her by the neck, slams her into the wall, and bites her shoulder. I can see this happen in real time, and my eyes are wide open. She lets out a blood-curdling scream, and she got away from him and slams his door shut and runs back to the main office area. Shez bawling her eyes out. The other nurse lady on duty is calling to get her transferred to be checked out. Shez also calling security and reporting the incident. I am just standing there wondering what I just witnessed. Well, I made the mistake of glancing over at one of the other guys' rooms, and Hez staring straight at me through his window in his door, mouthing, "You're next," while Hez pointing at me. I looked away, finished up the PCs in there, and had them escort me out after they made sure the one lady was okay and everything was handled. I did have to go back there a few more times to look for AWOL PCs, and I avoided all eye contact with anyone and made sure someone was with me the whole time. I was scared, but I didn't mind being the one to go back because I didn't want any of my other team members to be fresh meat, so to speak. I figured if they got used to my presence, it would be fine. Which it was. Yeah, props to the people who deal with those guys daily. I couldn't do that. The guy who pretty much destroyed his room and painted the walls in feces. The room couldn't be used for a while because it essentially needed to be rebuilt. The ED and NICU flooded at different times. No patients suffered negative outcomes from it that I'm aware of. It was mostly a nightmare for management. Patient who was not competent managed to sneak out and turned up in an entirely different state days later. There are a surprisingly large number of people who eat random things in their room that aren't edible. There's a couple others, but those actually made the news, so I don't really feel comfortable sharing on Reddit. Do animal hospitals count? We had a parvo puppy. If you know the small of parvo, you know. For some goddamn reason, an intern took him out of ISO all the way into the middle of the treatment area for his morning exam. The intern was gowned up accordingly, but the rest of us weren't. Needless to say, our little hero decided to void his bowels at just that moment. And a river of what can best be described as bloody gravy soon washed over our ICU. In an attempt to clean it up, 2 different assistants slipped in it and fell, thus covering this clothes, arms, and in the case of one of the unfortunate victims, her hair. That particular individual also hit her head hard enough to initiate a workers' comp claim and missed the next 3 days of work with concussion symptoms. Worst of all, the owners ran out of money and decided to euthanize, just as the little guy was turning a corner. Some days, I hate my job. This was one of those days. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe to see more.